Want to master that vintage shading style that makes your art pop? Today, I'm sharing 5 essential shading tips that every artist should know and demonstrating them by creating an original comic panel illustration. Let's dive in. What's going on, my dudes? It's Matt, and I'm back today with another RetroSupply tutorial. We noticed you guys responded really well to a part in the 10 inking tips video where I touched on comic shading, so we thought you guys might want a whole video dedicated to shading. So I'm gonna jump right in. Today I sketched out this rough pass of this comic panel illustration, and then I went over and did clean pass as well. Honestly, I already love it. She's such a cool dude. Dare I say it, she slays. And that's not a word I use lightly. So today I'm going to finish this drawing and share some tips in the meantime. Let's dive right in. Tip 1, understanding light. Alright, so before we jump into the fun stuff like halftones and cross-hatching, we need to make sure you guys actually understand how shadows work. It seems like a basic thing, but a lot of artists struggle with it. If that sounds familiar, I'm going to try to break it down to you guys as simply as possible, so even if you have a smooth brain like me, you can follow along. So first off, every shadow starts with a light source. I have this little sphere, and I'm going to decide on my light source. So let's just say, just classic, the light is coming in from right kind of above over here. Here's the sun, because the shadows on the sphere are going to look totally different if the light or the sun was coming in from this direction or even from down here. It's going to totally affect how the shadows are placed and how they fall and how the highlights show up. There are 2 main types of shadows. A core shadow, that's the darker side of the object where the light doesn't hit, and a cast shadow, the shadow that the object throws onto another surface. Like I said in a previous video, this comic book style shading, it's this really bold graphic approach. It's kind of similar to an effect called posterization, where you're basically just condensing the shadows into their simplest forms, which makes it a really good method of actually learning how shadows are placed on objects. So there's also reflective light. Everything has a certain luminance, whether that's because it literally glows or light from the sun or light is bouncing off of it, it casts light too. You'll see a lot of times in shading these simple forms that there's a light from the ground that bounces back up onto the shape itself. The way you could achieve this in this comic book or screen print style is simply erasing a small strip to create this sort of highlight effect. It plays into the realism and it makes it look like light is bouncing from the ground onto the sphere. Shape and form of the shape that you're actually shading determines how the light will affect it as well. So instead of a sphere, let me make this a little smaller. I will go in and sketch a cube. Right, so I have my little cube sketched, pretty much the same angle as the sphere, pretty much the same light source. You'll notice how the transition from light to dark is much sharper on a cube. And that's the basics. Light defines form, and shadows give it weight. Always identify your light source before you start shading, and think about how that light source will affect the objects in your scene. Tip 2. Study and modify forms. Let's be real, your shading probably sucks for one simple reason. You're ignoring your basic forms and how light interacts with them. Everything you draw boils down to spheres, cubes, cylinders, cones. Don't believe me? Let's look at my art here. So you might be looking at a lot of this stuff like, oh wow, so detailed, so complicated. But really, what are these mountains? Are pyramids? What is this rock? It's a sphere. Even this car, look how complicated this car is. It's just a box.
It's just a donkey.
It goes back in perspective and is shaved down a bit. So yeah, like everything can be broken down into these simple forms. Think of a sculptor. They don't start with details like eyes or a nose. They build the basic forms first and then refine. Your drawing should be no different. You should be practicing these shapes from different angles. And you should be introducing contour lines, which shows you how the surface curves and works in 3D space. And hey, I hear what you're saying, okay? Boring, I don't want to draw cubes all day. Well, these form studies, they don't have to be boring. Once you've nailed the basics, you can try to modify them. Like this sphere. Easily, if I just warp it a bit, it can turn into a squash or a pumpkin. And then once I apply my contour lines over it, look at that, boom. We got a perfect base to make a jack-o'-lantern sketch or an illustration. Tip 3. Shading brush techniques. Okay, alright, now we're getting to the fun stuff. Once you know how light behaves and understand the basics of form, there are tons of different methods and techniques to actually shade your drawings. Let's break down 4 essential shading techniques to level up your drawings. Hatching. Simple parallel lines. The closer the lines, the darker the shading. Cross-hatching. Layers of intersecting lines. More layers means deeper shadows and a richer texture. Stippling. Shading with dots. Denser the dots, the darker the area. It takes time, but it gives a unique textured look. And halftones. Patterns of lines or dots to create smooth gradients. These are perfect for vintage comic and retro effects. Alright, now you know what the techniques are. I'm going to show you how I personally would apply them to this drawing. I want to give this girl a little bit of shadow under her neck. This is my little trick, guys. I like to use selections while I'm doing my cross-hatching or my halftones, just because I can kind of define the shape of my shadow beforehand before actually jumping in and make sure I kind of stay inside those lines. For her skin, personally, I would use halftones or stippling, just because I feel like they're a little softer, works a little better for skin. So let's add those. This is a nice halftone shader brush from the Duplatone brush bundle, which is an awesome bundle. Like, really great shading brushes in there. And now if I wanted the dots a little smaller, I can adjust my brush settings, but for the purpose of the demo, that's fine. And notice how I'm being aware of my light direction. So I know the shadows would probably affect something like her arm, which is a cylinder, in this way where the highlights kind of fall on the left side and the shadow falls on the right. So I'll go in and do those halftones onto the rest of her skin later. Right now I'll show you some hatching stuff. I'm more of a fan of hatching than cross-hatching, to be honest. I just like the look of hatching better, but you know, that just comes down to total personal preference. So I want to add a little bit of dimension to the bottom panel of this card. The way these cards are shaped is kind of like this, so I want to show that there's a plane change there. So what I'll do is grab this line shader, which is also from the Duplatone pack. Again, great pack, guys. And I'll start doing this. And the way you want to approach your hatching is the line should always be kind of cascading towards the light source. So if you just kind of go in and apply it willy-nilly and not take into consideration where your lines are leading, it's not going to look right. So I know that my light source is coming from the left side of the screen, so my lines are going to point in that direction. And there you go. That demonstrates a little bit of a plane change, and I use some hatching. What you can also do is go in and do the brush the other way, and that creates cross-hatching. Again, I'm not a big cross-hatching guy, but you know, you do you. Another one I might incorporate into this piece is stippling. So I like to use stippling on stuff like natural materials, so like rocks, just for similar reasons of halftones, that it feels a little more natural, but still it has a bit of roughness to it, a little more than halftones do. Now stippling, that's gonna hurt your hand, so definitely I recommend, there's a bunch of stippling brushes out there. RetroSupply has one, Dot Dreams. All these techniques, you can really use any brush, but RetroSupplies are great, so maybe use those, I don't know. So yeah, for me the key with these shading techniques is not to overuse them. Definitely I would rely on these more solid areas of black, just because it creates a little more contrast and it's a little more relaxing to the eye than having a bunch of different line patterns. But definitely mix these textures up in your piece for texture and for depth. Tip 4. Use shadow to set mood. Utilizing shadow can be your ultimate tool if you're trying to achieve a certain mood in your artwork. Think of your favorite films and how they use shadow and light to set the tone for a scene, which you know is a solid tip in itself. Do some film studies. You know, these directors and cinematographers, they're masters at light, and it's a fun little challenge. So take a look at this panel that I drew up. This man, he looks friendly, he looks approachable. And now take a look at the same drawing, the same basic line art, but this time with dynamic and dramatic shadows. It's a totally different vibe, right? Now he looks like he might eat me or something, I don't know. Mastering shadow placement helps you control the vibe of your piece, and it helps guide the viewer's eye exactly where you want it. Tip 5. Don't overshade. Use negative space. Overshading can quickly overwhelm your art, making it look cluttered and hard to read. Too much detail drowns out focal points and flattens the composition. For example, is these shoelaces. I'm not going for hyper realistic shadows on these shoelaces. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time to shade a bunch of shoelaces. If you look close, it's kind of just a bunch of blobs, but they don't look chaotic or messy or unrealistic because I know how shadow works on basic forms. A shoelace is just a basic cylinder stretched out a bit and flattened. So I know generally that the light and shadow would fall on these basic forms in certain ways. Instead, use negative space, the empty areas around and between objects. In retro comic book and screen print art, negative space creates bold, striking visuals that are easy to read. It lets the viewer's eye rest and highlights key elements. And kind of the flip side of that, on the other hand of the coin, large flat black shadows can add bold, graphic contrast and drama, giving your art a strong graphic look that just grabs people's attention. In comic book art, this is called black spotting. It's where you add all these big areas of basic black that really sell your shading on these basic forms, and they grab a lot of attention. Now that I've shared my ancient shading knowledge, it's my favorite time of the day to actually finish this art and show you guys the process. So I'm gonna wrap up my inks and then color it using my halftone brushes from Color Lab. So let's go. Pretty cool, right guys? And while the coloring and the inking really make the illustration pop, it's my knowledge of shading that lay the foundation for the piece. So I think that about covers it for today, guys. Did you find this video helpful? What shading technique was your favorite? Drop it down in the comments, let us know. Share some advice with each other, we're trying to build this community. And we want feedback from you guys. We want to know what you guys want in a future video. Do you want more comic book stuff, like actual storytelling through comics? Do you want character design? We still got color theory coming up, composition, how I actually go about planning these comic panels. Let us know. Let us know in the comments. And if you found this video helpful, give us a little thumbs up. Takes 5 seconds. Maybe subscribe. That'd be nice too. Check out RetroSupply.co for all the stuff that I used today. These tutorials aren't dependent on RetroSupply products, but they help a lot and they're great. Trust me. Alright guys, well, I'm Matt, and I hope you guys have a great day and happy creating.